It was no small operation that arrived that night at the Garden of Gethsemane to arrest Jesus. The Gospel of John says that Judas arrived at the place, followed by the leading priests, a detachment of the Jewish temple police, and a cohort of Roman soldiers. That is, a force of 600 men. Though spurred by accusations from the leading priests, this was a Roman operation. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, had authorized the arrest. The Emperor Tiberius had already reprimanded Pilate for stirring up the population by his heavy-handed responses to disturbances. Pilate was anxious to play this one by the book, a quiet arrest, a trial by representatives of the Jewish Sanhedrin. Then he would examine the prisoner himself to determine what to do next. Although we have no evidence that Jesus resisted arrest, all four of our Gospels report that a scuffle ensued, weapons were drawn, and Simon Peter swung a sword at the head of one of the servants of the high priest and lopped off his ear. Resistance would have been futile, and Jesus was apparently convinced that his arrest was part of God's plan. He ordered his disciples to put down their weapons. Whether the intent of the authorities was to arrest the whole group or just Jesus, we cannot be sure. But as Jesus was bound and taken away, the others all fled into the darkness of the olive groves and escaped. According to the Gospel of John, Simon Peter and another disciple, whom I take to be Jesus' brother James, followed secretly at a distance to observe what would happen to Jesus. Christians were later quite eager to blame the Jews for Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. Although Jesus had his Jewish enemies, in the end the result was Roman through and through. Jesus was first taken to a private house in the middle of the night, likely belonging to the high priest Annas. The office of high priest was a political appointment made by the Romans. Joseph Caiaphas officially held that position in 30 AD, but his father-in-law Annas was the one who wielded the power over his shoulder. The priestly family of Annas controlled untold wealth and lived in splendor. They were able to exercise a monopoly on all trade associated with temple services. The people despised them. By striking at the heart of Annas' operation, temple trade, Jesus had touched the nerve center of their power. Since Jesus had openly ridden into the city the previous Sunday afternoon, allowing the crowds to hail him as king, it would be relatively easy to form a capital case against him. According to the Gospel of John, these leading priests feared that if they let Jesus continue, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy our place in our nation. We don't know how many gathered at the high priest's mansion late that night, but it surely was not an official meeting of the entire Jewish Sanhedrin. Jesus was taken into the house. Outside in the courtyard, a contingent of the Jewish temple guard had gathered and built a charcoal fire to cut the chill of the night. Servants and messengers were milling about. According to the Gospel of John, the mysterious other disciple, whom I take to have been James, was able to gain entrance into the courtyard and get Peter in as well, because the household servant woman who was guarding the gate knew him. Someone inside recognized Peter's Galilean accent and accused him of being with Jesus. Peter vehemently denied even knowing him. The clandestine and illegal nature of this trial is indicated by the time as well as the place chosen for the proceedings. The full Sanhedrin of 70 elders met in a special room in the temple compound during daylight, not in a private house near midnight. The idea was to get Jesus to say on the record statements that could then be reported to Pontius Pilate as seditious. Various charges were aired, and Jesus remained totally silent during the questioning. Finally, when asked point blank, "Are you the Messiah?" he did reply, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." What Jesus was saying was, "Yes, I am Israel's king, and you will see the manifestation of God's kingdom." Jesus' admission that he was the Davidic king was all they needed. Some of those gathered spit in his face, and he was delivered to the guards in the courtyard, who began to mock him and rough him up. They blindfolded him and struck his face, taunting him to prophesy who just hit you. Recently, two rather amazing archaeological discoveries have shed new light on this phase of the trial of Jesus that night. As part of the rebuilding of the Jewish quarter following the 1967 Six-Day War, the Israelis carried out extensive excavations, exposing the Herodian city as it was when the Romans destroyed it in 70 AD. As chance would have it, the archaeologists discovered the ruins of a magnificent palatial mansion that very possibly belonged to Annas. It extends over 2,000 square feet and is built on 3 levels, with easy access to and a magnificent view of the temple to the east. If this was the house of Annas where Jesus was condemned to die, the large room would have served as a type of judgment hall, and the courtyard below was visible from within, just as the Gospels describe. In November 1990, an even more chilling discovery was made. Construction crews building a park just south of the old city accidentally broke through a sealed burial cave undisturbed since the 1st century, with bones and ossuaries intact. As unbelievable as it sounds, it turned out to be the family tomb of High Priest Caiaphas. One of the ossuaries was inscribed Yehoseph bar Kapha, Joseph son of Caiaphas, and held the bones of the man who'd officially presided over the trial of Jesus. Sometime early that Thursday morning, Jesus was bound and taken under guard by his accusers to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Pilate was staying in the royal palace complex that Herod the Great had built on the western edge of the city. Since the high priests and their cohorts had ritually purified themselves to eat the Passover at sundown that evening, they did not enter the praetorium area, which would have been considered defiling. Instead, they stood outside on the steps, and Pilate came to meet them. He sat down at a judge's bench on the raised stone platform. The charges they registered against Jesus were purely political, not religious. That he was a threat to the stability of the nation, that he opposed paying the Roman taxes levied by Caesar, and that he himself claimed to be the rightful king as Messiah of Israel. Any one of these charges was enough in Roman eyes to merit death by crucifixion. Pilate took Jesus into the praetorium headquarters inside the palace walls to question him. All 4 New Testament Gospels offer elaborate descriptions of how Pontius Pilate found Jesus innocent of these charges and went to extraordinary lengths to release him, but was intimidated by the Jewish authorities and their supporters waiting outside, who demanded that Jesus be crucified. Scholars are agreed that little in these accounts of Jesus' trial before Pilate is historically credible. They have been completely shaped by a later Christian theological tradition that sought to put the blame for Jesus' death wholly upon the Jewish people, while exonerating the Romans as sympathetic to Jesus, with Pilate doing all he possibly could to save Jesus' life. What we know is that Pilate was known for his brutality, his cruelty, and his fearless disregard and disdain for his Jewish subjects. Since his arrival in Judea in 26 AD, his acts of arrogance and violence had become legendary. Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary Jewish philosopher and historian, described Pilate as naturally inflexible, a blend of self-will and relentlessness, a man noted for vindictiveness and a furious temper. Pilate had a reputation of handling arrests without trial and ignoring legal procedures. Even if Pilate thought Jesus to have been a harmless and deluded fool, he would have happily condemned him without the slightest hesitation. The portrait the New Testament Gospels present of Pilate is simply historically inaccurate. Concentrating on the more probable historical facts, we can say the following. When Pilate learned Jesus was from Galilee, he decided to send him to Herod Antipas, who was in town for the Passover and residing nearby in the palace. Herod had been seeking Jesus' death for some time, and he was pleased to finally have him in custody. Herod examined him at length, but Jesus refused to say anything in response. Jesus' accusers were present and repeated the charges against him. Herod and his soldiers decided to have a bit of sport with Jesus. They clothed him in a royal robe and began to treat him with contempt, mocking him as a so-called king. Herod then sent Jesus back to Pilate, having endorsed the decision that Jesus be executed by crucifixion. In Jerusalem, it was Pilate who had the jurisdiction to have the decision carried out. Pilate ordered Jesus delivered over to his Praetorium Guard, the most trusted and elite Roman troops in Jerusalem. They took Jesus into the courtyard of the palace and flogged him. This was standard Roman practice, a type of preliminary punishment for slaves or those sentenced to death by crucifixion. The soldiers did not often get a Messiah as a prisoner, so they took full advantage of the situation, placing a mock crown of thorns on his head, a reed in his hand, and bowing to him, hailing him sarcastically as King of the Jews. Pilate ordered a placard written in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew that read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Jesus likely wore it around his neck as he was led away, carrying the patibulum, or crossbeam, to the place of execution. The placard was then fixed to the cross, above the victim's head, to publicly announce his crime. The Romans crucified Jesus for sedition, for claiming to be a king. Pilate took advantage of the occasion to have two other Jewish prisoners crucified as lestai. This term, traditionally translated as thief, is regularly used by Josephus to describe the zealot brigands who had acted against Rome. This is the precise word used to describe the prisoner Barabbas, who had been arrested and slated for crucifixion for leading a violent insurrection. The two men crucified with Jesus were likely part of that recent disturbance. The point is, from Pilate's point of view, the three of them, Jesus included, are all guilty of the same thing, sedition against Rome. Jesus and the two other victims were led outside the city to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull, that the Romans regularly used for crucifixions. Josephus says they purposely chose locations that would be easily seen by passers-by, whether along main roads or atop hills. The most wretched of deaths. Josephus described Roman crucifixion as the most wretched of deaths. Anyone growing up in first-century Roman Palestine knew the horror of this form of terror by direct experience and observation. The hapless victims of crucifixion, left on the crosses for days, were a common sight to the Jewish population. Josephus reported that during the Roman siege of Jerusalem in the summer of 70 AD, the number of captives crucified reached 500 a day, so many that there was no wood left in the area as all the trees had been cut down. We know quite a bit about the methods the Romans used in crucifying their victims. In 1968, the skeletal remains of a Jewish male victim were discovered in a tomb just north of Jerusalem, off the Nablus Road. He was in his 20s, and his name Yehochanan was inscribed on his ossuary. His remains have given us an amazing glimpse into the details involved in Roman crucifixion as it was practiced in first-century Roman Jerusalem. We know that the nails were put through the forearms and not the hands. Physiologists have shown that nails through the hands will not hold the weight of a body, and nails through the wrists would have ruptured blood vessels. The science of crucifixion required that nails be affixed in a way to minimize bleeding, otherwise the victim would quickly pass out and die in a matter of minutes. The references in the Gospels to Jesus' hands being pierced use a Greek word that can be understood as including the forearms. The feet were nailed through the heel bone. It is the largest bone in the foot, and as with the forearm, puncturing this bone will not cause profuse bleeding. In the case of Yehochanan, the nail is still intact through his heel bone. When he was removed from the cross, the nail had bent on a knot in the wood, and whoever removed him simply cut the wood away, leaving it attached to his foot. Death by crucifixion was a slow process. It could take as long as 2 or 3 days. The victims were stripped naked, exposed to the scorching Mediterranean sun. Death resulted from a combination of shock, exhaustion, muscle cramps, dehydration, loss of blood, and finally suffocation or heart failure. Depending on the angle in which the arms and legs were nailed, death could be brought on more quickly or extended. The buttocks were supported by a piece of wood called a sedecula that offered some support of the body. Over time, as fatigue set in, breathing became acutely difficult. If there was a reason to hasten death, the legs of the victim could be broken, causing the body to slump and making breathing impossible after just a short time. The Romans often left the corpses to rot on crosses, but the Jews had a law requiring those hung on a tree to be buried the same day as they were crucified. When allowed, Jews removed the bodies before sundown and buried them. Since Yehochanan's legs were broken, his death was likely hastened to allow for burial the same day as his crucifixion. Jesus and the other 2 victims were put on their crosses by 9 a.m. Thursday. Whether Jesus expected God would rescue him before things went that far is impossible to say. What Jesus likely expected was a sudden, dramatic, and overwhelming manifestation of the kingdom of God. Perhaps a great earthquake that would destroy the Herodian temple, with the sun darkened, the moon turning blood red, the dead being raised, and the appearance of legions of heavenly armies in the sky. For Jesus, the prophetic 3rd day had arrived, and the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds of heaven was imminent. The Gospels report that the chief priests and others who had supported them taunted the victims, aiming particular scorn at Jesus. "Let the King of Israel come down from the cross that we may believe." Standing at a distance was Jesus' mother Mary, as well as Mary Magdalene and the other women who'd followed him from Galilee on this last journey to Jerusalem. According to the Gospel of John, the disciple whom Jesus loved was also present with Jesus' mother. Late in the day, when Jesus began to think he might die after all, he officially put his mother in the care of this disciple, whom I have identified as his brother James, now to be the eldest of the family. According to Mark, Jesus was on the cross from the 6th to the 9th hour, that is 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Toward the end, he began to sense his life slipping away. He cried out with a loud voice in his native Aramaic tongue, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." Those are the opening words of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me?" At that point, he bowed his head and breathed his last. Up until the last minutes, perhaps, Jesus believed that God would intervene, save his life, and openly manifest his kingdom. Since the Jewish Passover meal, or Seder, was to be eaten just after sundown that evening, the high priests had asked the Romans to break the legs of the victims to hasten death. The Gospel of John remarks, they did not want the bodies to remain on the cross during the Sabbath, especially since that Sabbath was a high day. When they came to Jesus, he appeared to be completely lifeless. One of the soldiers thrust a spear into Jesus' side just to be sure. He did not flinch. The king was dead.